My name is Cassidy. I am 30 years old, and last week, my mother called me crying for the very first time in my entire life. Her voice was trembling, stripped of all its usual cold authority, as she pleaded for a caregiver, for me to uproot my life, move back into my childhood home, and become her full-time nurse. Before she could even finish asking, before her tears could even dry on the receiver, I already knew the exact 4 words I was going to say back to her. 2 years ago, I was the one crying. I was 28 years old, sitting in a sterile, fluorescent-lit doctor's office, being told that I had stage 3 cancer. When I turned to my mother for help, she answered me with a single, flat sentence that I will carry with me to my grave. During the 6 months of grueling chemotherapy that followed, across 36 exhausting, nauseating appointments, not a single member of my family visited me. Not once. They were far too busy planning my younger sister's lavish, high-society wedding. But here is the part none of them ever bothered to check. While I was losing my hair, fighting for my breath, and drowning in medical debt, my mother was quietly sitting in a lawyer's office, signing a piece of paper that handed my sister everything. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where we tell quiet, powerful stories about the people who finally stop apologizing for taking up space in this world. If you have ever been the family member who is always expected to sacrifice, always expected to stay quiet while others take, then this story is dedicated to you. Before we dive into the wreckage of what happened, drop a comment below letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is right now. And if you want to see how the truth always, inevitably finds its way to the surface, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Now, let me take you back 2 years, to a cold Tuesday afternoon in Pittsburgh, and a phone call that changed my life forever. The architecture of the spare daughter. Before that phone call, my life looked perfectly steady from the outside. I worked as a senior paralegal at a small, highly respected elder law firm in the heart of Pittsburgh. My days were spent drafting complex Medicaid applications, reading through dusty property deeds, and calculating long-term care assets. I was incredibly good at my job. I voluntarily stayed late at the office because the law made sense to me in a way my family never did. In my office, there were columns that added up, rules that applied to everyone equally, and clear, predictable outcomes. I lived alone in a modest 1-bedroom condo that I had purchased with my own hard-earned savings. I had a premium espresso machine I babied every morning, and a deeply ingrained, almost pathological habit of being the person who handled things. In my family, I was the designated logistics coordinator. I was the one who booked my mother's eye appointments. I was the one who did my younger sister Vanessa's taxes for free every single April. Whenever something broke, whenever a bill was late, or whenever a crisis loomed, the phone always rang on my end, never the other way around. My few close friends called me dependable, which, if we are being completely honest, is just a polite civilian word for a woman who has never learned how to say no. I genuinely believed that my compliance was a strength. Day after day, I sat across from clients, warning them about the strict, unforgiving rules of elder care. I was the one who knew the fine print. I knew that quietly gifting a house to a favorite child can completely destroy a parent's eligibility for state-funded care later in life. I was the one whom grieving clients hugged and thanked, while their wealthy, entitled relatives stood around the conference room looking completely useless. Yet, despite all my professional training, I never once imagined that I would eventually open a county records portal and find my own mother's name stamped on the very document that would ruin her. The diagnosis and the wedding bell. That fateful Tuesday afternoon, I was in the quiet, climate-controlled back office of our firm, meticulously sorting a stack of 6-figure nursing home invoices for an estate client, when my cell phone buzzed with an unrecognized number. My instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but the discipline of my job made me pick up. A nurse's voice came through the line, polite but completely devoid of warmth. She asked me to verify my name and then told me, with an unsettling softness, that my primary care doctor wanted me to come into the office first thing the next morning. You should understand the structural shape of my family before I tell you what happened in that exam room. My father passed away when I was 12 years old. After his death, my mother, Diane, ran our household like a captain guarding the very last lifeboat on a sinking ship. There was always exactly enough resources to survive, but those resources were strictly rationed, and they always, without fail, went to my younger sister, Vanessa. Vanessa is 4 years younger than me. She was always the soft one. She was the daughter who cried easily, who bruised easily, and who was constantly comforted and coddled for her fragility. When Vanessa wanted to go to an expensive out-of-state college, my mother gladly wrote the checks, draining what was left of my father's modest life insurance. When I wanted to go to college, I was told that taking out maximum student loans would build character. By the time I turned 28, I had worked 2 jobs to nearly pay those loans off. Meanwhile, Vanessa had a pristine degree, a wealthy fiancé named Grant, and a wedding budget that seemed to expand by thousands of dollars every single week. None of this was a secret in our house. My mother had a favorite phrase she used at every single Sunday dinner, standing over her blue Pyrex dish of pot roast, the same chipped, stained casserole dish she'd used since I was a little girl. "This house," she would say, her eyes sliding past me to lock onto Vanessa, "stays in the family. The real family. You understand?" I understood completely. In my mother's eyes, the real family consisted of husbands, baby showers, and grandchildren. I was simply the spare set of hands. I was the unmarried, childless daughter who would always have a clear schedule because I hadn't filled my life with the right kind of people. My mother believed this dynamic the way some people believe in the changing of the seasons. She had watched her own mother get cared for by an unmarried aunt who gave up her career, her savings, and her youth to change diapers. Diane had decided, decades ago, that this was simply how the world sorted its women: the married daughter keeps the inheritance, and the single daughter keeps her schedule open for the caretaking. The call that broke the thread. The next morning, my doctor did not attempt to dress up the reality. "Stage 3, Hodgkin lymphoma," she said, her voice steady but sympathetic. "It's aggressive, Cassidy. It's highly treatable, but we cannot wait. We need to place your port and start chemotherapy in exactly 2 weeks." I sat in that tiny, white exam room and did the only thing my brain knew how to do: I went to work. I pulled out a notepad and began asking about the protocol. I asked about the drug cocktail, the number of cycles, and my exact out-of-pocket exposure after insurance. I had spent years watching clients get completely blindsided by the devastating financial gap of medical care, and I knew that the gap is where families ultimately fall apart. I copied the estimated numbers into my phone as if I were taking notes for a client, not myself. I did not cry. Crying was a luxury I had never really been allowed. In my family, my feelings were always carefully scheduled around someone else's much bigger, much more dramatic moment. I walked out of the clinic, found my car on the 3rd level of the parking garage, and sat with my hands gripped tightly at 10 and 2. I wasn't driving anywhere. I was just breathing in the cold air, counting the concrete pillars, and doing the brutal math on how a person survives this alone. And then, despite everything, my brain defaulted to its oldest, most desperate setting. I unlocked my phone, scrolled to the contact that simply said Mom, and let my thumb hover over the screen. I told myself that she was my mother. I told myself that cancer was a threshold so massive, so terrifying, that even she wouldn't dare step over it. I wanted, just once in my life, to be completely wrong about her. I pressed the call button. It rang twice before she picked up, sounding incredibly distracted. I could hear the loud, cheerful clinking of glassware on her end. Before I could even speak, she asked me what I needed, her tone carrying that familiar, subtle edge of annoyance she reserved for my interruptions. I didn't try to sugarcoat it. I said, "Mom, I have cancer. It's stage 3. I have to start chemotherapy in 2 weeks, and I'm really scared. I don't want to do this by myself." There was a long, terrible pause on the line. In the background, I could hear my sister Vanessa's voice, high-pitched and frantic, asking a bridal consultant about ribbon colors for the table centerpieces. Then, my mother let out a heavy, irritated sigh, the exact sigh she used when I brought her an inconvenient bill or a household chore she didn't want to deal with. When she spoke, her voice had a chilling, businesslike flatness to it. "Cassidy, we can't deal with this right now. Your sister is planning her wedding. I sat frozen, waiting for the rest of the sentence. I waited for her to say, but of course we will figure it out, or send me your treatment schedule, or even just a basic, human I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Instead, she filled the silence with a rapid-fire list of logistics. The wedding was in exactly 4 months. There was the venue deposit, the final dress fittings, and Vanessa's fragile anxiety to manage. You've always been the strong one, Cassidy, my mother told me, her voice smoothing over the edges of her dismissal. You'll figure it out. You don't need us hovering over you. It'll just make you feel sicker. I heard her cover the receiver with her hand and call out to Vanessa, telling her she'd be right there. Then, she uncovered the phone and added the final blow, try not to worry your sister with this right now, okay? She is under so much stress with the seating chart already. Okay, I said. That is the absolute worst part of the memory. That I said okay in my normal, polite, paralegal voice, as if she had simply asked me to pick up a box of napkins on my way home. We hung up. I sat in the dark of that concrete parking garage and understood, finally and with absolute clarity, that there had never been a line. There was only ever a calendar, and my life had simply landed on a very inconvenient date. I didn't call my mother again for a very long time. But as I started my engine and drove out into the Pittsburgh traffic, I began to watch my family the way you watch a dangerous storm system on the horizon, waiting for the day it would inevitably turn around and come looking for me. After my mother's dismissal, I gave myself 3 days to let the shock settle before I tried one more time. I texted Vanessa, keeping the words careful, small, and non-threatening, the way you approach someone you are afraid of actually needing. I told her about the stage 3 diagnosis. I asked her, quietly, if she might be able to come with me to just my very first chemotherapy infusion, so I wouldn't have to walk into that clinic entirely alone. I sat on my couch and watched the 3 gray dots on my screen appear, hover, and disappear for almost an hour. When her reply finally arrived, it was a massive, frantic paragraph about her final dress fitting, followed by a single line that would settle deep into my chest like a jagged stone. You don't even have a family of your own, Cass, she wrote. You actually have time for this stuff. I don't. I read those words 4 times, desperately trying to find the part where she had somehow misunderstood my message. But there was no misunderstanding. To my sister, my being single, childless, and living alone wasn't a personal detail of my life, it was a resource that the family was entitled to spend. My empty calendar belonged to them. Her full one was sacred. When I called my mother, foolishly hoping she would be embarrassed by Vanessa's cruelty, she sided with her instantly. Her tone was gentle, condescending, as if she were explaining a very obvious mathematical equation to a slow child. Well, Cassidy, it's not as if you have a husband waiting at home for you, she said. Vanessa needs real, active support right now. A wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime milestone. I put my phone face down on the granite kitchen counter and stood there in the silence of my apartment. Something in me went completely quiet that day. It wasn't a painful break, it was just a quiet, steady shudder dropping down over my heart, the way a house goes dead quiet after the very last guest finally leaves. I stopped asking. I would have asked the cold universe for help before I ever risked asking either of them again. The chemotherapy chair and the teal blanket. As it turned out, the universe did not send my mother or my sister. It sent a retired high school English teacher named Renee Albright. 2 weeks later, I drove myself to my very first chemotherapy infusion. The oncology suite was located on the 4th floor of the hospital, a long, sterile room filled with heavy vinyl recliners arranged in a wide half-circle, each one paired with a tall metal 4-pole standing beside it like a silent, clinical companion. I checked in, bared my arm for the port access, and watched the nurse hang the first heavy bag of toxins. She must have noticed me sitting there with no coat, no bag, and no companion, because she returned a few minutes later with a freshly warmed, folded blanket and tucked it gently across my lap without making a big deal out of it. It was a cheap, hospital-issue teal fleece blanket, its edges already worn thin and peeled from 100 industrial washes. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't special, but it was the only thing in that entire building that touched me with any kind of warmth or care that day. I gripped the edges of that fleece as if my life depended on it. I had brought my work laptop, of course, because work was my only remaining anchor. I spent the next 4 hours answering client emails and drafting elder benefit applications while my mother's strong girl let chemicals drip slowly into her chest. Looking around the room, I realized my isolation was a stark anomaly. The other 18 chairs were surrounded by pairs, husbands doing crossword puzzles out loud, grown sons reading sports pages to their mothers, young couples sharing a single set of earbuds to watch a movie together. I counted them twice, 19 chairs, 18 companions, and then me, holding onto a borrowed teal blanket just to stay anchored in my own body. When the infusion finally finished, the nurse asked who was picking me up. I lied cleanly, told her my ride was waiting downstairs, and drove myself home with my hands shaking violently on the steering wheel, the car radio turned completely off so I could focus on keeping the vehicle between the lines. The Sunday family dinners continued without me, of course. They had always been the absolute center of my mother's social world, and now they had tightened around Vanessa's wedding like an iron fist. Every Monday morning, my phone would buzz with photos dropped into the family group chat, the blue Pyrex dish steaming on the counter, captioned with things like, "Wish you were here, sweetie." There was never an actual invitation attached. There was never an offer to drive me, or a suggestion to drop off a plate of leftovers at my condo while I lay sick from the chemo. The very dish that had fed me my entire childhood had now become the centerpiece of a table that had quietly, systematically removed my seat. I quickly learned to mute the group chat on Sunday nights. The paperwork of survival. By my 3rd month of treatment, the financial reality of cancer began to set in. Even with my firm's decent insurance, my out-of-pocket medical bills arrived in plain, white envelopes that brought quiet violence into my mailbox. My share of the treatment, the scans, and the specialty medications quickly climbed to just under $38,000. I sold the few shares of stock I had managed to buy in my 20s. I canceled every single digital subscription, cleared out my pantry, and put the remaining balance on a strict payment plan that I knew would follow me for years to come. When the cash flow got dangerously tight in month 3, I broke my own golden rule. I called my mother and asked if she could possibly loan or float me even $3,000 until my insurance reimbursement cleared. Her reply came faster than any text she'd sent me during my diagnosis. "Cassidy, we literally just put down the final deposit on Vanessa's reception venue," she said, her voice tight with defensive annoyance. "There is absolutely nothing extra right now. But you'll manage. You always do." I didn't argue. By that point, arguing felt like throwing myself against a door I already knew was double-bolted from the inside. But as a paralegal, I couldn't help but notice the priority of the transaction. A deposit on a single-night party came first. My physical survival came second. I filed that fact away in the archives of my mind, dated and documented, in case it ever needed to be recalled. The final straw of that grueling year arrived in October, exactly 1 week before Vanessa's wedding. I had lost all of my hair by then, wearing a soft, gray cotton cap I'd purchased online. Against my own self-preserving instincts, I had decided that I would still attend the ceremony. I didn't want a seat at the head table, I just wanted to sit quietly in the very back pew, to be there because she was my sister. Then my mother called. Her voice carried that overly sweet, overly reasonable tone she always used right before she asked me to do something entirely unforgivable. "Cassidy, sweetie," she began, clearing her throat. "We were thinking, it might actually be best if you sat this one out. You look so unwell, honey. And you know these photographs are going to last forever. We just really don't want anything to pull focus away from Vanessa on her special day." She actually used those exact words, pull focus. As if my bald head and pale skin were an unsightly stain on a white tablecloth that she had thankfully noticed just in time to hide. I stood in my hallway, staring at my reflection in the mirror, thin, frail, bald under a cheap cotton cap, a 28-year-old woman fighting with everything she had just to stay on this earth, and I listened to my own mother ask me to spare her the social embarrassment of my illness. "Okay," I said. One last, quiet, final okay. I hung up the phone. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt the very last warm, hoping thing inside my chest go completely cold and steady, like a thermostat finally clicking off in an empty house. I stopped waiting for them. I stopped checking my phone for a text message of regret that was never going to be sent. In my family, my pain would always be scheduled around someone else's celebration. And a person can only receive that lease on life so many times before she finally decides to stop paying the rent. The teacher and the lesson. The only saving grace of that winter was Renee Albright. She had been assigned the recliner right next to mine starting in November. She was a retired high school English teacher who wore vibrant, silk scarves tied elegantly over her own thinning hair, and she carried a stainless steel thermos that she refused to explain to the nurses. After watching me work on my laptop through an entire 4-hour infusion, she had leaned over and said, in that dry, authoritative way only lifelong teachers can manage, "It sets an incredibly bad precedent to answer office emails while you are actively being poisoned, dear." I laughed out loud for the first time in 3 months. From that day forward, Renee began showing up for every single one of my scheduled appointments. She adjusted her own treatment schedule to overlap with mine on purpose, though she would never openly admit to the kindness. She always brought a second paper cup so we could share the contents of her thermos, which turned out to be an incredibly strong, homebrewed ginger and honey tea that did more to combat my severe nausea than any prescription the oncologist wrote for me. Renee had been a widow for 9 years. Her only son lived 3 time zones away in California, calling her every Sunday afternoon like clockwork. She had decided, somewhere in her grief, that loneliness was a practical problem that you solved by simply adopting whoever was sitting closest to you. One snowy afternoon, as we watched the flakes slide down the clinic window, she asked me directly who was driving me home. When I gave my standard, defensive answer that I was perfectly fine to drive myself, she gave me a look I recognized instantly, the look of a teacher who has just caught a student trying to turn in a completely blank assignment. Family, Renee said, slowly stirring her ginger tea, is just the people who actually keep showing up, Cassidy. The rest of it is just paperwork. I wanted to tell her that paperwork was my entire profession. Instead, for the very first time, I let someone else take the wheel. I let Renee drive me home. I sat in her passenger seat with that worn hospital teal blanket folded neatly over my lap, and I felt a profound, physical sense of relief that I hadn't experienced in years, the relief of not being the one who had to handle everything. The dollar deed. While I was recovering, my boss, Margaret Holloway, a brilliant, sharp-as-a-tack elder law attorney in her late 50s, handed me a brand-new estate file. It belonged to an elderly man in his late 70s whose family had convinced him to sign his primary residence over to his eldest son to keep it safe from the government, and who now required high-level nursing care that he couldn't afford. Margaret walked me through the brutal legal mechanics of what the family had done. People honestly believe that gifting a house protects their assets, Margaret said, tapping her pen against the deed. But in reality, they are just setting off a financial bomb. They completely forget about the Medicaid look-back period. She showed me the strict, 5-year look-back rules, the 60 months during which the state government meticulously combs through every single bank account and property transfer made for less than fair market value. She showed me the penalty divisor, the cold, mathematically precise formula that converts a gift into months and months of state care ineligibility. If you sign a house away for less than it's worth within that 5-year window, Margaret explained, you don't protect the parent. You strand them. You make them completely ineligible for Medicaid, leaving the family to pay tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket to cover the gap. I memorized that math. I filed the penalty formulas away in the back of my mind, never once imagining how those exact numbers would eventually apply to my own mother. Then, one evening, a casual comment from my mother during a rare 10-minute phone call triggered an alarm in my brain. She had spent the entire call detailing Vanessa and Grant's post-honeymoon kitchen renovations, but right before she hung up, she added a strange, self-satisfied comment. "Oh, and Cassidy, don't you worry about the family house," she said, her voice light and dismissive. "It's all completely handled." I've made sure it stays exactly where it belongs, with the family, so you don't ever have to worry your head about the upkeep. I asked her what she meant by handled, but she immediately got vague, pivoting back to Vanessa's marble countertops. But as a paralegal, I knew that tone. It was the exact tone clients used when they had signed a legal document they didn't fully understand and desperately hoped wouldn't be scrutinized. Where it belongs. With the family. The real family. For 3 days, I battled with my own conscience. Looking up my own mother's home in the county recorder database felt like a massive betrayal, like reading her private diary. But my professional training reminded me that a recorded deed is not a private diary. It is a matter of public record, explicitly designed so that no one can secretly transfer property out from under the eyes of banks, buyers, or the law. When I mentioned my hesitation to Renee over our weekly dinner, she simply shrugged. "Cassidy, it's a public portal," she said. "You're allowed to read public documents. That's not snooping, dear. That's just literacy." The next afternoon, during my lunch break at the firm, I opened the county recorder portal that I used a dozen times a day for strangers. My hand was shaking as I typed in my childhood address. I hit enter. The digital wheel spun for a brief second, and then the most recent recorded document appeared on my screen, dated 8 months prior, right in the middle of my second round of chemotherapy. It was a quitclaim deed. Grantor, Diane M. Atkinson. Grantee, Vanessa A. Atkinson, my sister's maiden name. Date of transfer, March 14, 2024. Consideration, 1.00. My mother had signed the entire house, the only real asset she owned, over to my sister Vanessa for a single dollar, while I was lying on my bathroom floor, bald and vomiting, begging her for a $3,000 loan to pay for my chemotherapy. I printed the deed. I needed to hold the physical paper in my hands to make the betrayal real. The office printer hummed, sliding the warm page into the tray. I folded it once, walked back to my desk, and slid it into a blank manila folder. Because the moment I saw that 1.00 transfer, my trained brain instantly ran the math. March of 2024 meant this transfer was sitting squarely, undeniably, within the state's 5-year look-back window. If my mother ever needed long-term care before March of 2029, that deed would not shelter her. It would completely ruin her. And she had absolutely no idea that she had just signed her own financial death warrant. I did not call my mother that night to scream, cry, or demand an explanation. I sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours, the printed deed resting flat on the wood while the cool evening air blew through the window. I knew exactly how a confrontation would play out. My mother would immediately burst into tears, accusing me of being greedy and jealous of my sister's happiness. Vanessa would rally our aunts and cousins, painting me as the bitter, unmarried daughter who couldn't stand to see her family secure their future. They would successfully rewrite the narrative, making themselves the victims and me the hostile aggressor. So, I did the hardest thing a person can do. I did absolutely nothing. I slid the quitclaim deed into a plain manila folder, labeled it with my mother's property address, and filed it away in my desk drawer alongside my own tax returns and insurance policies. It wasn't a weapon, it was simply a recorded fact. When Renee came over that Saturday, I silently handed her the folder. She read through the legal description, her eyes lingering on the names and the tiny 1.00 consideration stamp. She slowly folded the paper back up and slid it across the table to me. "Knowing is enough for now, Cassidy," Renee said softly, covering my hand with her own. "You don't have to do a single thing with this. You just don't have to pretend anymore." And she was right. It was a bizarre kind of liberation. The constant, exhausting mental gymnastics of wondering why my mother didn't care, or if I had somehow done something to deserve her neglect, instantly evaporated. The deed answered every lingering question. You do not legally sign your entire life's asset over to one child for a single dollar while telling your other child, who is fighting for her life against stage 3 cancer, that you have nothing extra to spare. I turned all of my remaining energy inward. I ate well, slept deeply, and focused entirely on my recovery. In the spring, exactly 11 months after my diagnosis, my oncologist walked into the exam room with a genuine smile. My scans were completely clean. Remission. Renee cheered so loudly she startled the nurses, forcing a group hug right there in the clinic. I let myself cry then, not out of sadness, but because I had survived the darkest storm of my life without a single hand from my blood relatives to pull me through. The architecture of a new life. Over the next 2 years, I quietly and methodically rebuilt my life from the ground up. I refinanced my condo, consolidated my medical debt into a manageable payment plan, and threw myself into my work. I spent my nights studying for the Certified Medicaid Planner credential, earning the professional designation that meant families and institutions had to respect my signature on state applications. I grew my hair out. It came back thicker and darker than before, a physical marker of the boundary between the woman I used to be and the woman I was becoming. Renee and I kept our standing Thursday night dinner date, a reliable, unshakable anchor in my weekly calendar. I finally learned what it felt like to be loved by someone who didn't view my existence as a chore or a backup plan. I kept my communication with my mother and sister to an absolute bare minimum. A polite text message on birthdays, a thumbs-up emoji on a holiday photo in the group chat, just enough to keep them from realizing I had completely checked out of their emotional ecosystem. Now and then, my mother would still drop a photo of her blue Pyrex dish into the chat, but the old, familiar ache in my chest was gone. The table they had set no longer had a seat for me, and for the first time in my life, I realized I was no longer hungry for anything they were serving. I believed the story was over. I had survived, built a career, and found a real family in Renee. But the universe is a meticulous bookkeeper, and it rarely leaves a ledger unbalanced. The call at 2 a.m. On a rainy Thursday evening in October, exactly 2 years after Vanessa's wedding, my phone began to vibrate violently against my kitchen counter. I was in the middle of chopping onions for a vegetable soup when I saw the name flashing across the screen, Mom. I froze, the knife hovering over the cutting board. My childhood instinct screamed at me to answer, but my modern boundaries told me to let it ring. I picked it up on the 4th vibration. Cassidy, her voice was incredibly thin, slurred at the edges, and shaking with a primal, terrifying fear. Cassidy, please. I'm in the hospital. I had a stroke. She had been admitted 10 days prior, but nobody had bothered to tell me. I later learned that Vanessa had actively kept the information from me, telling the extended family that she had it handled and didn't want to burden me while she figured out the logistics. What she actually meant was that she wanted to wait until they realized how expensive and difficult caretaking was going to be before they called in the spare set of hands. My mother's left side was partially paralyzed. She could no longer climb the stairs of the family home, she couldn't dress herself, and she required round-the-clock, hands-on physical assistance. She was being discharged in 48 hours, and she had no plan. As I listened to her weep through the receiver, I realized something chilling. She never once asked how I was doing. She didn't ask if my cancer was still in remission. She didn't ask if my business was doing well. To her, I was not a human being who had barely survived a deadly illness. I was simply an appliance she had left on a shelf for 2 years, and now that her house was cold, she was reaching to turn me back on. You've always been the strong one, Cassidy, she sobbed. I need my strong girl now. Please, you have to help me. I'll think about it, Mom, I said, my voice completely level. I hung up, washed the onion juice from my hands, and immediately called Renee. The strategy meeting. The family machinery wasted no time spinning into action. The very next morning, Vanessa called my office line. Her voice was brisk, corporate, and completely devoid of guilt, as if she were a project manager assigning weekly tasks to a junior colleague. Cassidy, look, we've already worked out the schedule, Vanessa said, barely pausing to breathe. Since you work from home 3 days a week, and you don't have a husband or kids to take care of, we think it makes the most sense for you to move your home office into Mom's guest bedroom. You can handle her morning routine, do her physical therapy exercises with her, and cook her meals. I'll come over on Sunday afternoons for an hour to help with her laundry. I leaned back in my office chair, looking at the manila folder sitting quietly in my bottom desk drawer. And what about mom's long-term care, Vanessa? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly casual. A stroke recovery can take years. Have you looked into state assistance? Medicaid? I could practically hear Vanessa rolling her eyes through the phone. Medicaid is for poor people, Cassidy. Mom has her home. If we ever run out of cash, we'll just take out a small home equity loan or sell the house to pay for private nursing. But for now, you living there solves the immediate problem for free. I see, I replied. And you're sure about that plan? Of course I'm sure, Vanessa snapped, her impatience flashing. It's the family home. It's security for all of us. Now, I need you to pack up your apartment by Tuesday. I've already told Mom you'll be there. I closed my eyes, feeling the cold, clinical precision of my elder law training lock into place. No, I said. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the line. What do you mean, no? Vanessa stammered, her voice rising in pitch. Cassidy, she is your mother. She is sick. You have the time, you have the space. I mean no, I repeated, my voice as calm and unyielding as a judge's gavel. I will not be moving in. I will not be her caregiver. And if you want to know exactly why, I suggest you meet me at Mom's house tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Bring the blue folder from her filing cabinet. We have some legal math we need to run. The air inside my mother's living room was thick with the suffocating scent of stale lavender and old papers. It was exactly 10 o'clock on Saturday morning. My mother, Diane, sat propped up in her favorite armchair, her left arm resting uselessly in her lap, her face drawn and visibly sagging from the physical trauma of the stroke. Across from her stood Vanessa, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her foot tapping aggressively against the hardwood floor. On the coffee table between us sat the blue folder I had demanded they bring, the one containing the paperwork for Vanessa's wedding vendors and the house files. Beside it, I quietly placed my own plain manila folder. I don't appreciate being dragged out here for a financial meeting, Cassidy, Vanessa hissed, her voice trembling with rage. Mom is incapacitated. She needs her daughter to step up and do her duty, not sit here reviewing bills like a cold-hearted accountant. You are her child. You owe her your care. I looked at my sister, then at my mother, who refused to meet my eye. Let's talk about what we owe, Vanessa, I said, opening my manila folder and sliding the certified copy of the recorded quitclaim deed across the polished wood table. Because 2 years ago, while I was sitting in a chemotherapy chair losing my hair, the two of you sat down right here and decided exactly what my place in this family was worth. You signed this house over to Vanessa for exactly $1. Vanessa's face went instantly white. She glanced down at the stamped document, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. How did you get that? That's none of your business. Mom wanted me to have the house. She said it was my inheritance because I was building a real family. It became my business the moment you called me to be her free, live-in nurse, I replied, leaning forward, my voice dropping into the icy, unyielding tone I used when breaking down asset fraud for clients. You see, Vanessa, you thought you were being incredibly clever. You thought you were hiding the asset from the medical bills I was accumulating. But you didn't look at the fine print. And in my line of work, the fine print is where families go to die. The Medicaid trap. I tapped my finger directly onto the date stamped on the top of the deed. This transfer occurred exactly 2 years ago, I said, looking directly at my mother, whose good eye was now wide with a sudden, sharp panic. Which means this $1 gift sits squarely inside the state's 5-year Medicaid look-back period. Do you know what that means, Vanessa? It means that because Mom had this stroke inside that 5-year window, she is completely, legally ineligible for state-funded nursing care or home aides. Vanessa let out a nervous, defensive laugh. I told you, we don't need Medicaid. We'll just take out a home equity loan on the house to pay for a private nurse if you won't do it. You can't, I said simply. You can't take a loan out against an asset you don't legally own anymore. The house belongs to you, Vanessa. And Mom has absolutely no income other than her tiny Social Security check. But it gets worse. Because the state looks at a $1 transfer as an intentional divestment of assets to defraud the system, they apply a penalty divisor. I pulled out a calculator, typing in the fair market value of the house, $320,000, and dividing it by the state's monthly regional care rate. The penalty for what you did is exactly 42 months, I announced, setting the calculator down on the table between them. That means for the next 3.5 years, the state will not give Mom a single dime for her medical care, her rehabilitation, or her medication. Someone has to pay for her private care entirely out of pocket. And since Mom has no assets left because she gave them all to you, that someone is you, Vanessa. The true cost of betrayal. The silence that followed was absolute. Vanessa stared at the calculator as if it were a ticking bomb. The high society lifestyle she had built with her husband, the expensive vacations, the country club membership, it was all staring down the barrel of a massive, multi-thousand-dollar monthly medical bill that she legally could not escape. No. Vanessa whispered, turning frantically to our mother. Mom, tell her she's wrong. There has to be a loophole. Cassidy, you're a paralegal, you fix this. Undo the deed. Fix the paperwork. I won't fix it, I said, gathering my papers and sliding them back into my folder. To undo this deed now would require a fraudulent reverse transfer evaluation, and I value my license far too much to protect a family that left me to die in a parking garage. You wanted the house, Vanessa. You wanted to be the centerpiece of the real family. Well, now you get to pay for the foundation. My mother finally looked up at me, a single tear rolling down her paralyzed cheek. Cassidy, please, she slurred, her voice breaking. I'm your mother. I stood up, pulling my coat over my shoulders, looking at the two women who had written me out of their lives when I was at my lowest. 2 years ago, I called you from a parking garage and told you I was terrified of dying from stage 3 cancer, I said softly, looking my mother dead in the eye. And you told me that you couldn't deal with it because Vanessa was planning a party. You told me I was the strong one. You told me I would figure it out. I tucked my folder under my arm, feeling the light, warm weight of the teal blanket waiting for me back in my car, the blanket given to me by strangers who actually knew how to love. You were right, Mom. I am the strong one, I said, turning my back on the blue Pyrex dish sitting lonely on the kitchen counter. I did figure it out. And now, the two of you are going to have to do the exact same thing. The unbalanced ledger. I walked out of that house, down the cracked concrete driveway, and I didn't look back. As I started my car and drove out into the crisp Pittsburgh morning, I felt the final, heavy lock of my childhood trauma click open. The ledger was finally balanced. Not through malice, and not through violence, but through the quiet, beautiful, unyielding weight of the truth. Thank you so much for staying with me through all 4 parts of this journey on Hidden Family Revenge. If this story showed you that the truth always finds a way to balance the scales, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another quiet victory. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have walked away, or would you have fixed their mistake? Until next time, remember, protect your peace, choose your real family wisely, and never stop taking up space. I'll see you in the next story.